She stood at the altar in a white dress she never wanted to wear, staring at a man she'd sworn to destroy. The guests whispered. The flowers bloomed. And somewhere deep in her chest, beneath the hatred and the lies, something impossible began to stir. This is the story of how love became the cruelest weapon of all. It started with a lawsuit. Not flowers. Not fate. A lawsuit that tore two families apart and left nothing but ash and anger in its wake. Emily Carter was 28 years old, sharp as a blade, with dark eyes that could cut through pretense in seconds. She worked at her father's law firm in Boston, a place built on reputation, legacy, and one unshakable rule: never lose. Her father, Richard Carter, was a titan in corporate law, the kind of man who could dismantle empires with a single phone call. Emily had spent her entire life trying to live up to his shadow, to prove she wasn't just his daughter but his equal. And then came the Brennan case. Michael Brennan was the son of a real estate mogul who'd been accused of fraud, of siphoning millions from investors through shell companies and offshore accounts. The case was ugly, public, and personal. Richard Carter represented the victims. Michael's father, Thomas Brennan, hired the best defense team money could buy. The trial dragged on for months, each side bleeding the other dry with motions, appeals, and media storms. Emily watched her father age 10 years in 6 months. She watched him lose sleep, lose weight, lose the light in his eyes. And she watched Michael Brennan sit in that courtroom every single day, stone-faced, silent, as if none of it touched him. She hated him for that. For his indifference. For the way he seemed to float above the wreckage his family had caused. The trial ended in a mistrial. A technicality. A loophole. The Brennans walked free, and the Carters were left to pick up the pieces. 3 of the investors lost everything. One of them, an elderly man named George Whitman, took his own life 2 weeks after the verdict. Emily went to the funeral. She stood in the back, watching his widow weep, watching his grandchildren try to make sense of a world that had suddenly turned cruel. And she made a promise that day. She would make the Brennans pay. Not through the law. The law had failed. She would find another way. 6 months later, she saw him again. Not in a courtroom. In a coffee shop on Newbury Street, of all places. Michael Brennan, standing in line, ordering something absurdly complicated. He looked different. Thinner. Tired. There were shadows under his eyes that hadn't been there before. Emily's first instinct was to leave. To turn around and walk out before he saw her. But something stopped her. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was anger. Maybe it was the way he looked so goddamn human in that moment, so far from the monster she'd built him up to be in her mind. He saw her. Their eyes met. And for a second, just a second, something unspoken passed between them. Recognition. Exhaustion. A shared understanding of what it meant to carry the weight of other people's wars. He didn't smile. Neither did she. But he nodded. Just once. And then he left. Emily told herself it meant nothing. That it was a coincidence, a meaningless moment in a city full of strangers. But she couldn't stop thinking about it. About him. About the way he'd looked at her, not with hatred or contempt, but with something that felt almost like resignation. 2 weeks later, she got a call from an unknown number. She almost didn't answer. But something told her to pick up. It was him. Michael Brennan. His voice was low, careful, like he was stepping through a minefield. He said he wanted to meet. To talk. Not about the trial. Not about their families. Just to talk. Emily should have said no. Should have hung up, blocked the number, and never thought about it again. But she didn't. She agreed. They met at a bar in Cambridge, a quiet place where no one knew their names. They sat across from each other, 2 people who should have been enemies, and for the first time, they talked. Really talked. Michael told her things she didn't expect. That his father had lied to him. That he'd found out about the fraud only after the trial started, and by then, it was too late to do anything without destroying his entire family. That he'd wanted to come forward, to tell the truth, but his father had threatened to cut him off, to ruin him, to make sure he never worked again. That he'd been living with the guilt ever since, watching it eat him alive from the inside out. Emily didn't know if she believed him. But she listened. And when it was her turn, she told him about George Whitman. About the funeral. About the promise she'd made. About how much she hated him, hated his father, hated everything the Brennan name stood for. Michael didn't defend himself. He didn't make excuses. He just nodded, like he'd been expecting it, like he deserved every word. And then he said something that changed everything. He said he wanted to help. That he had access to files, records, proof that could reopen the case and put his father behind bars. But he couldn't do it alone. He needed someone on the inside. Someone who knew the law, who knew how to build a case that couldn't be torn apart. Someone like Emily. She should have walked away. Should have seen it for what it was, a trap, a manipulation, another lie in a long line of lies. But she didn't. Because for the first time in months, she saw a way forward. A way to keep her promise. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. They started meeting in secret. Late nights in empty offices, in parking garages, in hotel rooms where no one would recognize them. Michael brought her documents. Emails. Bank statements. Recordings. Everything she needed to build a case that would bury his father for good. Emily worked tirelessly, cross-referencing every detail, making sure there were no holes, no loopholes, no way for Thomas Brennan to slip through the cracks again. But somewhere along the way, something shifted. The meetings became longer. The conversations became deeper. They talked about things that had nothing to do with the case. About their childhoods. About the pressure of living up to impossible expectations. About the loneliness of being seen only as extensions of their fathers, never as themselves. Emily started to see him differently. Not as the enemy. Not as the son of a criminal. But as a man who was just as trapped as she was, just as desperate to break free. And Michael, for his part, started to see her not as the daughter of the man who tried to destroy his family, but as someone who understood what it meant to carry a burden that wasn't entirely yours to bear. It was dangerous. They both knew it. But they couldn't stop. One night, after a particularly long session, they sat in his car outside her apartment. The rain drummed against the windshield. Neither of them moved to leave. Emily turned to him. Asked him why he was really doing this. Why he was willing to betray his own father. Michael was quiet for a long time. And then he said, because some things are more important than blood. Some things are worth losing everything for. She kissed him. She didn't plan it. Didn't think about it. It just happened. And he kissed her back. And for a moment, the world outside the car, the families, the trial, the hatred, all of it disappeared. All that existed was the two of them, tangled up in something they couldn't name and couldn't escape. But reality has a way of crashing back in. A week later, Emily's father found out. She didn't know how. Maybe someone saw them. Maybe he had her followed. It didn't matter. He confronted her in his office, his face red with rage, his voice shaking. He called her a traitor. Said she betrayed everything their family stood for. That she was sleeping with the enemy, destroying her own credibility, throwing away her career for a man who would never choose her over his own blood. Emily tried to explain. Tried to tell him about the evidence, about the case they were building, about how this could finally bring justice for George Whitman and all the others. But Richard didn't want to hear it. He told her she had a choice. Walk away from Michael Brennan, or walk away from the family. She chose Michael. It was the hardest decision she'd ever made. And the moment the words left her mouth, she saw something break in her father's eyes. Something that might never be repaired. She moved out that night. Took only what she could carry and stayed at a friend's place while she figured out her next move. Michael was waiting for her. He held her while she cried, while she questioned every decision she'd ever made, while she wondered if she'd just destroyed her life for a man she barely knew. But he didn't let go. And slowly, painfully, she started to believe that maybe, just maybe, she'd made the right choice. They finished building the case together. It took 3 more months of sleepless nights, of paranoia, of constantly looking over their shoulders. But they did it. They had everything. Enough evidence to not only reopen the case but to guarantee a conviction. Emily handed it over to a federal prosecutor she trusted, someone outside her father's orbit. The indictment came 2 weeks later. Thomas Brennan was arrested at his home, led away in handcuffs while news cameras swarmed. Michael wasn't there. He couldn't be. The day his father was arrested, he sat in Emily's apartment, staring at the wall, silent. She didn't know what to say. Didn't know how to comfort someone who just destroyed their own family to do the right thing. Finally, he spoke. He said, "Do you think it was worth it?" Emily thought about it. About George Whitman. About her father. About everything they'd lost and everything they'd gained. She said, "I think we'll spend the rest of our lives trying to figure that out." And maybe that was enough. The trial was swift. Thomas Brennan was found guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. The victims finally got some measure of justice. George Whitman's widow sent Emily a letter, thanking her, telling her that she'd given them closure. Emily cried when she read it. Michael's family cut him off completely. His mother refused to speak to him. His siblings blamed him for their father's downfall. He lost his inheritance, his name, his place in the world he'd been born into. But he didn't lose Emily. They stayed together through all of it. Through the media circus, through the whispers and the judgment, through the nights when he woke up gasping, convinced he'd made a terrible mistake. She was there. Always. And slowly, painfully, they started to build something new. A life that wasn't defined by their fathers, by their families, by the weight of expectations they'd never asked for. A life that was theirs. 2 years later, they got married. It was a small ceremony. Just a handful of friends. No family on either side. Emily wore a simple white dress. Michael wore a suit he'd bought the day before. They stood in front of a judge in a courthouse in Vermont, far from Boston, far from the ghosts that haunted them. And when the judge asked if they took each other, if they promised to love and honor each other through whatever came next, they both said yes. Not because it was easy. But because they'd already been through hell together. And they'd chosen each other anyway. Emily's father never forgave her. He sent a card on her wedding day. No message. Just his signature. She kept it in a drawer, a reminder of everything she'd lost and everything she'd gained. Michael started a small consulting firm, helping companies clean up financial messes before they became legal nightmares. It wasn't glamorous. But it was honest work. And for the first time in his life, he felt like he was doing something that mattered. Emily left her father's firm and started her own practice, focusing on victims' rights, on the people who got trampled by the powerful and the corrupt. She didn't make as much money. But she slept better at night. They bought a house in Providence. Nothing fancy. Just a small place with a garden and a porch where they could sit on summer evenings and watch the world go by. And sometimes, late at night, when they couldn't sleep, they'd talk about everything that had happened. About how 2 people who should have been enemies became the only thing holding each other together. About whether love was enough to make up for all the pain they'd caused and all the bridges they'd burned. They never came to a solid answer. But they kept trying. kept choosing each other. Kept building a life from the rubble of the one they'd left behind. 3 years into their marriage, Emily got pregnant. It wasn't planned. But when she told Michael, when she saw the look on his face, the way his eyes filled with tears, she knew it was right. Their daughter was born on a cold morning in February. They named her Grace. Because they needed the reminder. That even in the darkest times, even when you've lost everything, grace can find you if you're willing to reach for it. Emily held her in the hospital, this tiny, perfect thing that was somehow theirs, and she thought about all the choices that had led to this moment. All the risks. All the heartbreak. All the impossible decisions. And she realized something. She wouldn't change a single one. Michael sat beside her, his hand on Grace's head, and he whispered, "Thank you. For believing in me. For not giving up. For choosing this." Emily looked at him. At this man who'd given up everything to do the right thing. Who'd loved her even when it cost him the world. And she said, "I'd choose you again. Every single time. Because some love stories don't start with flowers and fate. They start with fire and fury and two people who refuse to let the world tell them who they're supposed to be. They start with a choice. And then another. And another. Until one day, you wake up and realize you've built something that can't be torn down. Now, 5 years into their marriage, life is quieter. Grace is learning to read. Michael's business is growing. Emily's practice is thriving. They still don't talk to their families. Maybe they never will. But they've built a new one. A chosen one. Friends who became family. People who see them not for their last names, but for who they are. And on the hard days, when the weight of everything they've lost comes crashing back, when Emily wonders if her father ever thinks about her, when Michael wakes up in the middle of the night, haunted by the memory of his father's face when the verdict was read, they hold each other. They remind each other why they did it. Why they chose love over legacy. Why they chose truth over comfort. Why they chose each other when the whole world told them not to. Because in the end, that's what love is. Not the easy kind, the kind that comes with congratulations and champagne. But the kind that asks everything of you and gives you something in return that you didn't even know you needed. The kind that says, "I see you. I see all of you. The broken parts, the scared parts, the parts you've been trying to hide. And I choose you anyway." So let me ask you this. What would you have done in Emily's place? Would you have walked away from your family for love? For justice? Would you have believed Michael when he came to you with the truth? Or would you have seen it as just another lie? And if you were Michael, could you have done it? Could you have turned on your own father, even if it was the right thing to do? Even if it meant losing everything? I want to know. Drop a comment below. Tell me what you think. Because this story, this impossible, messy, beautiful story, it's about more than just two people. It's about the choices we make when there are no good options. When every path leads to loss. When love asks you to sacrifice everything you thought you were. And maybe, just maybe, it's about the fact that some things are worth it. Some people are worth it. Even when the cost is everything. And if you think this story was intense, wait till you hear what's coming next. Because we've only scratched the surface of what love can do when it collides with the real world. Subscribe so you never miss what happens next. These are the stories that stay with you long after the video ends. The ones that make you question everything you thought you knew about love, about loyalty, about what it means to choose yourself over the expectations others have placed on you. Thank you for watching. Thank you for staying till the end. And remember, love isn't always the fairy tale. Sometimes, it's the war. And sometimes, the war is worth fighting.